Good morning, Jennifer. How are you today?
Good morning, Dr. E. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, you know I love doing these podcasts with you. I feel like I say this at every single podcast. I'm super excited, but I really am.
Me too.
So I thought this was a great topic because, as you know from clients, patients we work with, and this comes up all the time at Communicamp about the buddy process. And I would say the far majority, parents, even teachers, and some professionals, it's really difficult for them to know what the buddy process really is. And sometimes they think it's simply pairing a child with another child and, okay, I've got the buddy process going. Do you experience that too?
I do. In fact, I think just hearing the idea of like the buddy process, I think sometimes teachers feel like it's just a friend that this child is comfortable with, or not even a friend, but maybe just I've partnered them with someone that I think might be good. And so they're with someone. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the right person to get this process started with, but it's someone.
Right, exactly. So it's almost like I guess I look at it like a very surface level understanding. And one reason I wanted to do this podcast, it's been coming up over and over and over with families saying to me, well, they come to the SMart Center that I've had an IEP, I've had a 504. I don't understand. My child still doesn't seem to have any friends. My child still isn't talking. You know how I feel about that. Talking to peers. And I don't know what to do. So you have to dissect it. You have to pull it all the way back and kind of figure out, all right, let me understand this child first. But in addition, like, what are you doing to build that connection and comfort? And what strategies, interventions are you doing? So that's how I think. So I think one of the things that I'd want to start with is that there's critical golden rules, as I call them. And one golden rule that we talk about a lot everywhere and anywhere, written in a lot of my materials, is comfort precedes communication. Progress does not tend to occur in a group. Therefore, we need to build comfort and do strategies and interventions away from the group as a first step, as a way to kind of get that going. And we do that basically four ways. One is the buddy process. The other is through get-togethers, play dates with those buddies outside of school, small groups in the room, such as spot work, and small groups out of the room, such as friendship groups, clubs, activities, recess bunch, lunch bunch, etc. And so if those setups are there, that's great. And I think you're familiar with this, that we talk about this a lot at camp is, okay, you got the setup. Now what?
Yeah, and I think those pieces, the logistics of getting things set up really are key, because without those pieces, we're not able to really launch into what I think most teachers and parents want, which is like the comfortable communication and what are the strategies to grow the communication. So those, what I think are like those key elements, are important.
It's almost like you're building a house, right? It's like the architectural layout. We have to have that structure in place, but there's so much more than just the structure. In some ways, those are accommodations, but now we have to implement, facilitate strategies and interventions for progress to occur. And of course, for each and every child, we need to understand their whys and we need to understand their baseline stage. So if they're a shutdown child, we can't expect them to be verbally initiative, elaborative, and expressive. We can't even expect them necessarily to speak at all anytime within the next, in a short period of time. Maybe they'll start to progress once we understand them, but it's unrealistic to push speaking when you don't even have an engaging child. So I can't emphasize enough for our listeners that understanding of the child or teens' unique needs, which are their whys and how that impacts them, but how it impacts accommodations and interventions and what we need to look for, maybe what is causing SM, but also what's reinforcing SM, and their baseline stage on the social communication bridge. So that's a given, right? It's not how do I get my child to talk, it's understanding them. So let's focus on the buddy process, which is what this podcast is about. And I think it's important to say, in your mind, why is the buddy process such a critical component of comfort precedes communication?
So for me, the buddy process I think it's helpful across the board for teachers. It's going to benefit teachers. It's benefiting the child. and it's helping the parent. And I think that's just, I'm going to speak globally, that I think all SCAT strategies have their place of helping all parties involved. It's a holistic approach. And so when I think about the buddy process, for me, the pieces that come up initially are, if your child or your student with selective mutism is coming into a brand new environment where they're not as comfortable, they haven't acclimated to the environment, they're not feeling as familiar, what better way to start them into this, new social engagement, but then to have somebody they already have an existing comfort, existing communication with, existing familiarity with, that they can go with. So for me, it's like passing the baton. So if you think of like a relay race, they're already having a baton of comfort right in their hands to take with them to move in. So it's starting them a little further along in their comfort by having that person that perhaps they've already had play dates with, if they're a younger child, and they've already spoken to this person and they've hung out with them and played with them. That familiarity is already there, and they're coming out into this new environment with that sort of comfortable anchor. And for our older kids, having someone that they've already hung out with who knows them, especially our middle school and high school kids, we certainly know that coming into brand new environments can be so awkward and uncomfortable. And if you have someone that you know and knows you, it's like your person, it allows you to walk into that environment and not feel so awkward, so isolated. So for me, that buddy process is key in stabilizing their first steps in comfort. And how that impacts others is, I think parents sometimes, when they know their child has someone who's an extension of them going into the school, if it's camp or school, the first day of the school year, a new extracurricular activity, scout, soccer, whatever that may be, or a new club, parents then are more relaxed and comfortable knowing their child has someone to move forward with. And then I think from a teacher perspective, teachers then feel a little more comfortable knowing this child has a buddy that they can come into the school year with, that they already know, that they can speak to if they have a need, perhaps if we work those strategies. But I think it helps everyone. And if everyone is feeling a little more comfortable and feels like, okay, we've got this first step underway, I think all parties, child, parents, and teachers, walk through this process a little more comfortable. So it's not just for the child. For me, the buddy process encompasses all people.
No, that's a great explanation. I think it's important to know too, for our listeners, the buddy process will help with the implementation of strategies, whether it's sounds to words, whether it's use of a verbal intermediary, to help that child make that progress and being with somebody comfortable. I think one of the things that maybe our listeners are struggling with is, especially post-COVID, although this has always been a challenge prior to COVID, but I've seen since COVID, play dates, get-togethers outside of home have absolutely diminished in comparison. Families just don't do it as much. I think they just got in a habit. They're busy. They're living their life. But there are many patients we see on an ongoing basis, and I know this comes up time and time again at camp every single day, of how do I help my child find a buddy? Like, my child doesn't have any friends. We don't have neighbors near us that we get together with. There's no one, we haven't had outside play dates. So how would you say, and I'll definitely share my ways as well, to find buddies within the school environment? That's number one. And I think the other question is, how do we get these schools to be able to implement a buddy process? So we're going to answer those two questions kind of quickly. But I think that's important, because we can pick all the buddies we want, but if the school's not implementing the buddy process, which has to be implemented, there's just nothing else to say. Children aren't going to become friends and start making progress on their own without having this basic setup. It doesn't happen. Or if it happens, it takes a really, really long time, because you're asking these children to, initiate nonverbally, to go up to be able to make friends, to have that consistency. It's going to take the school involvement. It's going to take teachers facilitating strategies. It's going to take some of the special social workers, psychologists, if needed, to have these small group opportunities outside of the room. It's just going to have to be there. Without that, I don't know what to tell people. It doesn't just happen miraculously. So I guess to go back to, how do we help them find the right buddies?
I think this is a really good question. I also think it's been a challenging question that I've heard a lot of parents share, that it has gotten harder, as you said. And so a few things. One, in the school environment, just to piggyback. And I think, hearing the parents' challenge, because we could say, just find a buddy, get them acclimated to some new friends and get them comfortable. And I think parents often come back with, how do I do that? And I think that's a really important question. In the school environment, certain elementary schools, we're just seeing a growing trend of, it's not the same as it might have been before, where you can meet, you just know, the kids in your class, their parents, and you see these parents. Oftentimes there's, for privacy, we're just not sharing parent information with everyone. Oftentimes it's one or two parents can sign up for a class party to help out or to volunteer in the classroom. And we don't always have access to seeing all the kids and their parents at pickup. And so because of that, and because kids aren't always their schedules, as you said, whether we're doing sports or activities on the weekend, we may not even be gravitating towards the same extracurricular things on the weekend. So how do parents get to know other kids in the class when things are changing? And I think that's sort of just a growing, place to look for better solutions and talk to the school. So a few things that I might suggest to parents when this is the case, and again, thinking ahead of all different ages, a few things that I look for if your child does not have any peers or buddies yet. A few things we can do. There's things we can do before school starts and during the school year, depending on when we're showing up to this challenge. One is, if it's before the school year begins, yes, you want to make sure we're sort of being active in, if we're having play dates at your local pool over the summer or in your neighborhood, asking others, parents questions of, what grade is your child going into, or do you know who your teacher is going to be yet? Those are just from a parent perspective. We need to be facilitators of, we have to seek out the information. So things that you can do in your neighborhood, among play dates in your neighborhood, local pool, if you're joining a pool, or if you're doing extracurriculars or camps over the summer, is to ask questions. That's one piece to get to know if you do have anyone who is in your school. I've recommended this next strategy to a number of families coming into new grades over the summer, where I'll say, from a personal standpoint as a parent, and I usually do this for those in elementary school, I say K through 6. If you are on social media, let's say Facebook, for instance, you have the opportunity to create a Facebook page for your child's grade. So for instance, you could say, my child goes to Smithville Elementary School, and I'm going to create a page. My child's going into second grade. Parents of second graders and you can use an abbreviation for the school name. By doing that, you can contact the school counselor over the summer or other admin and share that you started this page if a parent should ask. If your child's coming back for an orientation night, you can share that Facebook page. And that sometimes also helps to get people acclimated. And so they can share that information. That information can then be given to school staff so other parents can join on and they can be part of that group. So this would be other second grade parents who find out about your Facebook page. And what that does is, over the summer, kids can join in these groups through social media, and you're having hangouts. Not all these kids may be part of your class, but that's just one way. If you're not familiar with who the kids are yet, you can take an empowered role of saying, how can I create a social place that parents get to know each other? And how can I ask the counselor, or once I know my teacher, to share this information among my peers, or share it with parents at orientations or back to school night? Those are some things before the school year begins. But once we're in school, let's say we don't do that and we come into the school year and we don't know, some things that we might need to be looking for is, one, if your child maybe is not gravitating toward, all kids in the class yet, but mentions one or two kids to you once they're acclimated to that group or that school year. Things that I look for and I might share with my clients is, if your child is coming home and sharing some names of individuals, take note of those names. This is where we might then begin to ask, are they participating in any extracurricular activities that you can parallel outside of school? Can we do play dates with any kids from school? And do we then go to the teachers and ask for more information, or can you share information with these parents that I would love to get to, have a play date with my child and theirs? And these are just some ways that we might begin to orchestrate some getting to know you if you don't. And I will say that a lot of our students coming into their grades, no matter the elementary school age grade, let's say, for instance, if we're speaking to elementary school parents, sometimes if it's a new school, let's say we just moved and we don't know anyone, yes, it might take a little bit of time to get used to the classroom and warm up. But this is also a two-part component of, how can we find out names of children that my child might be interested in But this is where we do have to get the teachers involved to have some information. So that's going to be really important for a lot of our families. And for our older kids, it's even harder because, like you said earlier, we can't ask our teens to just go up and initiate and start conversation with friends. That is so challenging for all kids of all ages, even some of us as adults, to just walk up and initiate conversation. So we really have to look at what clubs, what small group opportunities are available in school. Who are we sitting near? Who are we doing activity and life with during the school day? Because these are the people that we're going to attempt to build out from and expand from.
No, these are all great ideas. One thing I would say that I'd like to add, because everything you said was just great. I love that Facebook idea. It's wonderful. And utilizing school professionals to maybe even contact other families saying, are you interested in doing get-togethers or activities, let's say over the summer and so forth, is talking to the teachers. So let's say the child's in school, because remember, let's think this is a child that's not very engaging. They're not very comfortable. Whether you're preschool, elementary, or middle school, asking the teacher, who do you think are good matches for my child? This happens a lot where, let's say we have a child, I'm thinking of a 3rd grade little girl I'm working with now, and she happens to love art. And that's her thing. And there's another little girl in the class that also loves art. This could be anything. Finding the areas of interest that these children can connect with. So the teachers are very conscious with pairing, grouping, sitting a child with other children who seem to have similar interests, maybe similar academic levels. As we know, many of our kids are very bright. So they are stimulated by maybe higher level interests. Pair and group them with those children so that they can feel connected. Also games and activities. If they don't know that right away, we go back to those golden rules of the buddy process, the get-togethers outside of school, the small groups in the room, the small groups out, lunch bunches, doing things like lunch bunch or friendship group with games and activities based on their stages. So even if they're nonverbal, they can point, they can show, the teacher can facilitate, hand over, take over to other children to help that move along. Doing different activities like interview games, headbands, all sorts of friendshipy group ideas based on their stage of communication and their comfort to build that away from the group. Because very often our kids, when they're in the midst of what I call a group, their true personalities are not coming out. So where they start to come out is away from the group. So when it comes to play dates or get-togethers, one, it's awkward if you don't have a connection. When you're a preschooler or even an elementary student, especially early elementary, it's really easy for parents to talk with teachers, set the world up for them, as I call silent goals. But as children age, it's awkward. So when parents, and this happens all the time, parents are like, my middle schooler, my high schooler are not setting up get-togethers. I don't get it. I need her to ask this friend. Well, number one, the child doesn't have the comfort and connection enough to be able to initiate even non-verbally a get-together. They just can't do that yet. It doesn't mean they won't. So we have to rely on the school to help us find those buddies and pair and group and sit with those children so that in the school environment, that is all happening. And then through that, we can consider get-togethers. But I have families that can't get get-togethers much. It's just really, really hard. Of course, the ones that do, they do the best. And bringing 1-2 kids over, then rotating kids in and out. I mean, that's a whole nother podcast in itself. I've had to kind of transition to smaller and larger groups using the buddy process. But I think it's really important because if we don't rely on the school and we don't work closely with the school, these things are not going to happen, which goes back to that other question of how can this be? What if a school says to you, Jen, we can't implement the buddy process. We can't pair and group your child with specific children. It just doesn't work with our setup. It doesn't mean we're gluing those children to other children, but it's a subtlety that makes sense. It's how to help them find connections. So that goes to school-based accommodations, interventions, especially within a public school. In a private school, it's a little bit of a different matter.
Yeah.
And finding the right school that's willing to do it. What feedback do you have on that?
So this is actually interesting because the buddy process is supposed to be helpful and not just, I will say, not just helpful for your child with SMs, whether it's your student that you're picking up on this from or a parent. The buddy process shouldn't limit a child. And I think sometimes what I hear, because you sort of tapped on the idea of, well, what if it just doesn't work for the school and they're not able to keep this child with another child, across settings. And I think sometimes there's a misconception. Maybe this happens a little bit more often too, as we get into elementary and middle and high school, is that, hey, this one child who's my SM client, student, or my personal child, this one buddy is the main buddy and the only buddy. And so therefore they need to be with this one buddy all the time for the next, several years of school. And I always point out that's not the buddy process. The buddy process isn't picking one student for the lifetime of your child's academics, right? From year to year to year. Although we can have a mix of children who just tend to be a good fit for your child, who may rotate across years, but it really shouldn't, like what I usually will tell to schools or parents is that the buddy process should be there to empower your child, to engage them more confidently, and to expand their social communication. Because those three pieces say, if I can have a buddy that I'm comfortable with, and I know and I feel engaged with, and I'm coming into my classroom environment feeling a little more relaxed, I can do more things with this peer with me. That's that empowerment. I can come in to your classroom feeling a little better, or whatever that looks like across the school day. But it should then engage my child. That buddy is not there just to sit next to them. We want to be utilizing that buddy to engage them more so in the classroom. So it shouldn't just be they're off to the side in their own clique and they're not communicating to anyone or participating. Or what we sometimes hear is, sometimes parents will say, I don't know if I want my child paired with this SM child all as much as they have been. And I always say, if we've gotten to that point, we might not have been using the buddy process the way it was intended, because it's intended to build that comfort and then to engage that child more actively in the classroom, and then to expand them to other peers. So we don't want to just lock into one peer. We're looking to sort of grow their group. And that's what you mentioned, several ways to grow the group, not just pairing with one child, but your buddy and maybe one or two other children. And we're sort of, I don't know, you said the word juggling. So now I'm thinking like we're sort of juggling these three peers throughout their small groups. And then we're doing a lunch bunch with those three peers. And the reason that's important is because what if the buddy that, let's say, the teacher picks on behalf of your child, or you pick, is out sick or travels? And then what do you do when that buddy is now no longer in school? We don't want that child to stop engaging and not communicate. So I can see where sometimes teachers feel like, whoa, we can't pair this child all the time with this one child. Maybe that's not the healthiest dynamics. And I would agree that in time, it should do those three things. It should empower, engage, and expand the communication. And the other part too is, if we're using the buddy process correctly, we should have a group of kids by the end of the school year, several that we have now. We might have started the school year with none that we were comfortable with, but because the teacher's maybe observing that your child engages with one or two of these kids pretty comfortably and starts them with that group, that doesn't mean you start them there and leave them there. It's what we do with the strategies. And then as we add a few kids to that grouping, by the end of the school year, we have a handful of kids that if we're going to make let's say an accommodation, right, request would be the next school year, we want to pair them with two or three of their comfortable, familiar, or verbal friends. We should at that point have a few to pick from if we're using the buddy process correctly. So I always attempt, when I'm speaking to teachers, acknowledge that, yes, if you're I have a high school client, I cannot have my high school client in every single class with one friend because they're in two different tracks academically, their classes are changing. However, we are able to take that buddy and pair them up in some pretty important places, like when they go to the cafeteria for lunch, they have the same period, they have a resource time together. And so then we start to look at other classes that we can get some familiarity with, people to grow, not having to have the same exact kids across every single class. That would be a scheduling, challenge for schools. But there's always a way to make it work if we're using the buddy process correctly.
Yes. And I like that you were talking about, multiple children. I tell families all the time, think 3 to 5 kids. Obviously, the younger the child, it might be 2 to 4, or 3 to 4. But 3 to 5 children that you pair with, group with, sit with, do small groups with, and rotate them. And as you said, as they build comfort, we rotate kids and communication progress, rotate kids in and out of those groups, and to the point where, because one of the challenges, again, another podcast, is how do you go from comfort communication in a small group to progression to being able to be verbal and communicative in a large group. And that's a whole process in itself. But I think it's really important that we tell families it's 3 to 5 kids that we parent group with, trying to find areas of interest that will help connect them, and working closely with the teachers and the parents to be able to facilitate those interactions through the buddy process, the small groups in and out of the room, but the play dates and get-togethers. And I just want to talk about the concept of a train ride. Think of buddies as a train ride. You get on stop 1 and you have 3 buddies, and you move along and you're working on strategies, interventions. A child is working specifically with one child on a play date because it turns out the parents are friends. The child comes over with very excited, very little effort was needed to progress them into speech. The parents had the kids run around outside. The child just spontaneously began to speak. That may be different than someone else where the parents have to facilitate an interaction through areas of interest, through visuals, bringing the child in through choice, maybe using this or that, tell me, there's many different ways and tons of different strategies to use that might help that child make the progress. But that comforting connection is critical. Child becomes verbal. Parents then go to the playground for the younger child. The child is verbalizing spontaneously. The parents may be playing a game like I Spy, something green, and the child starts to verbalize. The parent goes into the classroom in the spot, playing some games like headbands, child's verbal. That's a perfect verbal intermediary now. So now the teacher has a child that the child has progressed into speech with. And during class, if they're doing a small group or even just that child and a different child, do you want red or blue? No answer, red or blue, tell Rebecca. And then the teacher repeats with that eye contact. I need to tell our listeners that's a really basic strategy. That's not hard to implement and it's very easy. Does that always work? No. And we have to tweak it. And there's lots and lots of ways. Because Jen, I definitely want to do a podcast on how to kind of finesse this transitional strategy. So many people think verbal intermediary, this or that, tell Rebecca, that's it. It is so many ways to finesse a verbal intermediary and how to use it so the child can become verbal. It's not just having someone you talk to. So I definitely want to do a podcast where we dive in a little bit deeper into some of these transitional strategies, sounds to words and so forth, and how to really kind of use that for families. But I was giving that example because the nice part of that example was that child who went home, parent transitioned it into school. Then maybe we have to meet with the teacher and do a fade in with the teacher. So the teacher's there doing an area of interest and the child progresses into using parent, let's say as an intermediary. Maybe they're using sounds to words. Maybe they're just comfortable and the teacher asks a choice and the child speaks because there's no one else around. I mean, again, I don't know, but I think it's really important that we understand that train ride of moving people onto that train and then kids move out, kids move in and so forth. So it's like with each stop, you're pulling people off, you're pulling people in to the point where, maybe there's all a bunch of new buddies and now it's a small group, a medium group, a larger group of buddies. Do you see it that way as well?
I do. And it's a constant rotation, right? I think another thing that's important for teachers and parents to be aware of is that, there are kids that may not want play dates or teens that aren't comfortable. They don't have anyone yet and that they want to get together with or be partnered with. So when we're asking our kids, who do you want to be partnered with or who you're comfortable with, not all are sharing that. And that's where Dr. Ayu said, teachers being involved and helping to start the pairing process is important. I think it's also important to recognize, you mentioned the whys of SM earlier, and knowing how this child with SM presents is equally as important. Some kids, if they're more sensitive or sensory sensitive, they may be more likely to want buddies that are predictable, calm, or even a little more quiet, because it allows, with the teacher's facilitation, an easier time to come into communication with these peers. Where there also may be kids that they prefer someone a little more outgoing, because this outgoing child carries the conversation and brings them in. They have more energy and brings the energy up for our kids with SM. And it's not always clear right away who to partner them with. I just had a school consult with a child who was moved to a group of all very quiet peers. And this child is not making progress with these quiet kids. But when they are with another child who's a little more talkative and silly and outgoing, my client with SM tends to, build up a little bit in their energy and comes into communication easier. And so we have to be aware of that. And I think parents sometimes, Dr. E, you have a phrase that you use all the time, which I love, which is look, listen, and learn. Sometimes we have to look at what worked before, or what type of kids did my child do well with, and what type of kids sometimes they were comfortable with, but may not move forward in progression. And I think it's important to look at those pieces. So if we start the school year, or you're in the school year and you've partnered with some kids, there's nothing wrong with evaluating that, and that's what our team meetings are for, or your 504, your IEP meetings. When we're talking about accommodations, it's not just having a buddy. It's, well, what type of buddy, and where are we utilizing them, and how are we utilizing them? And if they're not a good fit, well, how do we then start to bring alongside a new person, right? That train ride that you mentioned, bring alongside a new student, and what might that student's personality be like to help grow that child's engagement. And as you said, we're thinking about growing their communication and getting that train ride, those 3 to 5 kids. It does take time. It depends on what grade level we're looking at. Sometimes we have to accommodate a little differently, depending if it's an elementary, middle, or high school student, because the way they're going to engage with peers and where they're going to engage with peers is going to vary a little bit. An elementary school child who's in the same class all day may have more opportunities for pairing up and then seating, running errands, going to special area classes with the same grouping of kids, where our middle school and high school kids begin to separate a little bit. And so it requires us to have more engagement and dialogue with school staff as a team, and also be open to who are the most important buddies that we're going to start with, who are we going to add on, and who are the team members who may help to facilitate some of the smaller group interactions that are going to be needed to make this successful.
No, those are excellent points. And there was something you said in there. You said about, building the comfort or having the comfort. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand that you could be comfortable with another peer. So what some families listening to this are saying, but wait, my child has buddies they're comfortable with. They're just not making the progress. And that's where, as you said, that's where you have to back it up. Like, I have a session this afternoon with a middle school boy who has buddies, right? But he's not making the progress, right? So this is my second consult with the family, and the family's already been doing some of the interventions, and the child's doing great. And the psychologist emailed me this morning to say, well, this happened. Now he's being able to quietly respond to me. We had to back it up. I had to put together an entire plan, which was chart-based, because this child is very anxious with a control, knowing what, when, and where. So a lot of the charting had to be done on how to utilize, in this particular case, weaning out somebody he was like a parent to be able to verbalize with, so that the child saw step by step what he was doing. And I don't want to get too into that particular chart because they're all kind of tweaked and different, right? But the point is, it's the path, it's the journey. It's like when you're going from one point to another, you have to have like a map, a GPS. And so what a lot of people, or a lot of our listeners, are thinking, he's already comfortable. Why isn't he talking? So it's about the specific strategies and interventions. I can't say that enough. It's not just comfort. That's the prerequisite. So if they're not comfortable, build comfort, connection, engaging activities and strategies. But if they're comfortable and they're stuck against the nonverbal wall, stage 1 to get to stage 3, we have to utilize transitional strategies, Jen. We have to utilize the use of the verbal intermediary, possibly sounds to words. But again, the category of a verbal intermediary, the category of sounds to words, the category of using augmentative devices, that's like gigabytes of information and how to tweak that. And I know you're laughing, but so many people are like, I use the verbal intermediary. Meanwhile, they describe it completely wrong to me, and they don't know how to tweak it. I must have thousands, I don't know about thousands, but hundreds of charts of how to tweak a verbal intermediary, how to teach teachers how to ask questions, when to ask questions, where to ask questions, and how to utilize these charts that we put together. And it really is an individual approach. And I think this is what's really key. So the buddy process is critical for comfort, connection. As you were saying, the 3, I loved how you described that with the buddy process.
It was the 3 E's: to empower the child, to engage them, and to expand them socially.
Yeah, I love it. And progression of communication, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important. And I'd love to be able to give a couple examples of a comfortable child, but the child does have a buddy, but how do we start to expand on some strategies to help them expand even their speech in these situations? Teachers bringing them in through questioning, through choice or the write and read. But what if the child is only answering one word? How do you help them begin to become a little bit more initiative, but also a little bit more expressive? I think that's important. I'm already talking about a child that's somewhat verbal with a buddy, but they're not necessarily initiative and responsive. And then I'm going to ask you a question. So to think about it. If I have a child who is verbally responsive, he can answer my questions. I don't care if he's 10 or he's 15. He can answer my questions. It may not be loud. It may not be expressive. Can I get them to be verbally initiative within 10 seconds?
100%.
Exactly. Now, I know the listeners are like, wait, that's impossible. How do you do it? You know how to do it.
Well, and so this is great because you're right. If a child is able to verbally respond to you as the teacher or whoever that is in the classroom environment, by using activities that utilize a write and read approach. So again,
right.
It wouldn't matter if I said, what was the score of last night's Phillies game, right? We're in Philadelphia. So, what was the score of that game? And I said, write that down for me. If they were able to write that down for me and give me that answer, they're verbally responding. But if I also said, let's write out the full question. What was the score of last night's Phillies game? Which team played against the Phillies? It wouldn't matter the questions. If I say, let's write the question out. And I said, okay, let's read back that question. And they're able to quietly, maybe not overly, elaboratively, to have a full-on conversation. But if they can just read back, what was the score of the Phillies game? They have verbally initiated a question back to you by using that approach.
So friendship groups, small groups, even children that are in middle school, upper school, reading a question from a book, from a page. I mean, so I think what is important, really, really important, is comfort is critical, but it's not enough. So yes, comfort precedes communication, but it's not enough to become a confident social communicator because the interventions are needed. Right. The strategies, the teacher facilitation, it's critical. And so even though a child may be comfortable with peers, great, we've gotten that, paired, grouped with, sat with, did all that, handover, takeover, going, passing out, they're not making the progress because the interventions aren't there. It's how do you implement and facilitate the strategies developed by your treatment professional.
Yeah.
That's critical. It's not just comfort. And I think that's important because how many times do we hear she's comfortable, she's not speaking, you're missing the interventions. Correct. The transitional stage of communication is a critical missing link in all school-based accommodations that and I shouldn't say all, that's pretty, drastic of a statement, but I would say 9 out of 10 IEPs and 504s that we read miss the boat with how to implement specific strategies to help that child progress communicatively. Correct. Not just verbally, not even just using an intermediary and repeating without eye contact, not just quiet 1 or 2 words, but elaborative, initiative, regular volume, confident, because that confidence is going to exude other areas of their life. If you have a really anxious, shut down child and you're trying to build connection and comfort and they have a flat affect because of their anxiety, that's not inviting. Right. That is not inviting to others because others are seeing them with that flat affect. So that connection, the comfort, the anxiety lowering strategies and interventions are really, really needed.
So what I hear you saying too is, just to back up, you said something earlier on that said about getting stuck, right? And so I think that's a good, I think for any listener, whether it's a teacher, professional, or parent, if your child is stuck, meaning you've plateaued, we've got the buddies, you've got the comfort, all the things that you listed, yet something is not growing, then that is your place to say, pause. Let's reevaluate some things of what might be missing. Because again, sometimes a teacher may say, let's jump ship from, we have to switch up the buddy. Then we have to, that we may start putting other factors into the mix that may not be necessary. It might be keep the buddies, keep the groups. What strategy are we utilizing? If a teacher's like, we're doing great, we're nonverbal, we're participating nonverbally, but we're not looking at what can they do to bridge up. So if that child has a comfortable buddy, but maybe only speaks to them outside of school and the others have never spoken to, well, then maybe we have to start working on that transitional strategy to say, if we're speaking to this peer outside of school, how do we bring this into the group? Or how do we use the write and read approach? If your child is able to write and read, oftentimes, if they can give a quiet verbal response, sometimes we as a parent or a teacher may say, well, then when they want to initiate and share, they will. They can verbalize. They just don't want to. And I'll say, it often is not want, it's we don't know how to insert and carry forth that expressive piece, whether that's because there's any maybe expressive language difficulties or lack of practice. Are we giving pathways for communication? Meaning, if they're in a group setting and everyone else is talking around them, engaging in the group, and no one's asking our child with SM to even respond or give an answer, they might be able to verbalize, but they don't have the opportunity to. And that's where taking a pause and looking at, how do we have these groups set up? What is the role of this child with SM in these groups? What is the role of their buddies? And what is the role of the teacher? Because in all parts, everyone has a role to play until that child is now starting to operate and verbalize on their own. And again, in time, we may not need as structured accommodations alongside this child. We can back up as they're making gains. But in the beginning, if they're stuck, we need to reevaluate why they're stuck, and then look at the strategies, the peers, the environments, and the opportunities that we're giving.
And also, when children go long enough and not do something, they don't know how to because they never had to. So they almost have to relearn a new way. So when parents will say, or teachers, well, he doesn't ask questions. He could be super bright and doesn't have a lot of questions to ask, or just doesn't need to, but has learned not to, doesn't think to ask questions, not because there isn't a question to ask, but I'm so used to not because of this skill basis. Other thing I want to mention is that the bridging up and bridging down. What that means is if you have a child that has a buddy and one-on-one, they're verbal, they're talking to their child quiet, to their peer, sitting next to them because we've strategically paired them and grouped them. They may hang out in the outside, quietly verbal. In the classroom, the teacher is there. Child's not very comfortable with the teacher. Child gets quiet. Teacher needs to know how to facilitate the use of that verbal intermediary in that case. But also in a larger group, too, is that maybe that peer is an intermediary. So that rather than not speak at all in a large group, maybe that child is paired and grouped with that child so the teacher can say this or that, no answer, this or that, tell Robert. And so the point is you bridge up and down based on the size of your group. And so maybe in a small group, the child's reading directions. Maybe he's answering questions with 2 or 3 peers because we've expanded the buddy process. But now in a larger group, he's using those peers as intermediaries. So the key is to understand and not see that as a weakness, not see that as a failure that the child isn't verbal in a large group, but they've bridged down in the sense that they are verbal. They're not shut down. They're not nonverbal. They're using an intermediary. And then as you use the intermediary more and more, child gets louder and louder and louder. So I think it's really, really important to understand all of this. And this is where our school trainings come into play. This is where parent education during our, consultations through Communicamp come into play. It's like we teach parents, we help them understand this so that it makes sense. Because if they're projecting their own anxiety and fears onto their children, or teachers are frustrated. Literally this morning, I got an email from a school psychologist working with a client of mine, a patient of mine, a girl, a middle school girl, saying to me, I'm feeling a lot of pressure. I really, really need to to get this child to talk to me. The pressure you're feeling and putting on yourself, this child has gone from shut down, engaging, to being able to answer your questions through quiet words. That's huge progress in literally a month. And now she's feeling pressure to get her to be elaborative, initiative, and expressive. I need to talk to that psychologist because the pressure that psychologist sadly is projecting onto that child, our highly sensitive children, is insane. And the parents may sometimes do that too. So how much work do we have that we have to kind of calm the parents down? I need them to talk to their friends. She's not doing this. She's not doing that. But they're doing other things. So we have to focus on the positives, minimize the negatives, and be upbeat and positive and supportive rather than you need to and you should.
I agree. I think the other piece too is that it's not a one size fits all. And you were talking about some of the different strategies like the verbal intermediary, or, using, nonverbals or sound work, or even moving up to write and read. All of these things take finesse and knowing your child. So although there are some really good general pieces that I think are really important about the buddy process, knowing how to use it and knowing the right definition of each of these terms and what the process means is important, because sometimes we're implementing it, like you said, but we're not implementing the way it was meant to be implemented, or the way it's being defined is incorrect. And those are things that need to be worked on through those sessions, whether it's parent coaching, school consultation, in client sessions or camp. We really try to emphasize, what are we looking at? Let's troubleshoot this and get to the core of where the miss is so that we can move forward.
And I think it's important that we cannot rely on the child, on the teen, to do all this on their own. It's about facilitation. And as adults facilitate in their lives, it does become more natural, especially the older the child is, and we're helping them with the coping skills and teaching them when this is occurring, what are some things you could do? So we're definitely working with the child. But when you're in this space, such as the school and the classroom, when you're having a get together, when you're out in the real world, it's the facilitation that's critical. So for families that take their children to therapy and hang out on their phone and then come back a week later and the child is, not making all the progress, one, I'd say, what are you doing to facilitate? What are the teachers doing to facilitate? You cannot rely just on the children. And that's not fair, because the children don't know how to navigate this on their own. I don't care how old they are. It takes time. Of course, as they get older, upper school, college, and older, yes, it's way more on them, and we're working with them to teach them. But I say one of the biggest problems that I see is relying on the child that quote unquote goes to therapy to do all this, to go up spontaneously. They may not be ready for that.
That's right.
So obviously we could go on and on about utilizing, the buddy process and how to utilize it and so forth. But I think this was a start, and we do welcome questions to come in from our, listeners on this particular topic. And definitely would be great to have parents on here talking about buddy process and asking their questions, because I love it when we have the parents on here, because, that's real time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Dr. Reed. It's always great speaking with you. I wish we had several more hours, but our time is ending.
We have Communicamp coming up in a couple weeks, so we'll be spending 3+ days together, almost 4 full days together.
It'll be great.
All right, Jen, have a great day.
Thanks, you too, Dr. Reed.
Bye.